in a constant state of fear and misery. Do you miss me anymore? Live in a constant state of fear and misery. Do live in a constant state of fear and misery. Do you miss me anymore?
Hello, everybody. So today is Sunday, February 3rd, and we're bringing you Block Digest number 154 at block height 561,386. And sadly, Rick is not joining us because he is off visiting family right now. But we have Janine and two surprises, Mr. Chris Ellis and Mr. Blake Anderson.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. That's how we roll.
So what is going on today, everybody?
Living the dream.
I'm just getting back used to using Google Hangouts. Right, I've got the chat opened up from the YouTube live stream. I think we should check out what they're saying. How is everybody doing? Good to see you again. Sorry, I'm not around much these days. Plan to change that this year. How are you doing, guys?
I'm doing good. I got to jump in the chat so I can get in a big fight. It's not.
Start trolling people.
It's not an episode that features me without getting into a big.
Do you need that link to logicalfallacies.com just so you can make your way through the list?
Fascism is totally justified.
The ad hominem. Don't keep going back to the ad hominem. That's a lazy argument. You want to go with, I think, No True Scotsman today. You're not a real Bitcoiner. How can you call yourself a real Bitcoiner if you think Bitcoin's bad for the environment? Come on.
I'm gonna go with some appeal to nature. Nature is how I define it, and then I'll residually just appeal to that definition, and then I'll win all arguments in perpetuity.
That's right.
So, hey. What is up with you today, Miss Quiet?
Pretty much same old. What has happened recently? I've just mostly been watching the hilarity still that's been going on with Facebook and Google getting kicked in the butt by Apple.
Aha! Monopoly slugfest?
Well, the term that I used was Battle of the Walled Gardens, and people seem to like that.
Yeah.
Nice. Beautifully illustrated.
That is a good one. Alrighty, though. So, are we all ready to dive into this this first confusing topic?
Yes.
You mean this perplexing topic?
Yes. That
the correct YouTube nomenclature. Let's just jump on into it.
Fuck YouTube nomenclature.
So I guess we're just gonna jump on into it. Smash that subscribe bell, fam squad.
All right. So anybody from Canada should know Quadriga CX and all of the troubles that they've been going through for many months now, which began with, I think, what was it, around $50 million that was held by their processing bank in fiat. And it kind of came out a little after the fact. The reason the money was being withheld was due to the suspicious nature of the money's origin. And this turned out to be a number of wires for exactly $100,000 that were made in quick succession with no kind of note through the bank wire system as to who they were coming from or what they were for. And they have since updated things so that pretty much any kind of wire has to have a unique amount to them, as well as a notice of what it's for. So hopefully that, well, I mean, I guess that would have been not really an issue, but more things started compounding on themselves. So while the court was dealing with this and eventually freed most of the money to yet again be frozen by the next bank, and is stuck in the middle of dealing with their payment processor as of right now, looking for banks to accept the deposits to go through with refunds for the customers. It finally came to light almost a month after the fact that their CEO and founder had apparently died of complications due to Crohn's disease in India on December 9th. And this was announced through a notice on their website, which has since been removed and replaced with a notice of a creditor protection application to their customers, although there is an archive of the original message in the show notes. And pretty much it was just your typical kind of death notice, like, you know, paying respects to the man and speaking of his accomplishments in building the company and, you know, his involvement in the cryptocurrency space and inspiration of others in the company. And then a short Q&A kind of explaining a lot of the things that have led to withdrawal issues, delays, and so on, as well as an updated notice of new withdrawal limits that have been imposed. And then very recently, a sworn affidavit was submitted by members of the company in court filing for creditor protection, claiming that the private keys for all of their cold storage were secured on an encrypted laptop owned by the CEO that nobody has successfully been able to get access to. And there's been a lot of kind of speculation, a lot of people looking at this as a potential exit scam and not simply a security fuck up. And really, I think, you know, looking at everything that's available, there's really not enough information to really definitively state what actually happened here. Despite, you know, in my personal assessment, I do think this looks very suspicious. So to kind of go through like both sides of things, you know, on the more suspicious side of what possibly could have happened here, he was in India effectively to manage the building of an orphanage through a program, I believe it was called Angel Houses, where you can sponsor the construction of a building for orphans in India. And one of the most suspicious things here to me personally is that prior to departing for India, while the company he founded was in huge turmoil because of all of these withdrawal issues due to the fiat being seized and subject to a court battle, which is in itself suspicious, I would say, he actually went through the steps of finalizing his will, leaving everything to his wife. And so, like, it seems very odd to me that he would take a step like that before traveling and not consider at all the operations of his business, which had over $100 million in cryptocurrencies that is owned by over 100,000 customers on the platform. Because in Canada, this is was one of the biggest platforms in the country. And so, like, just the entire sequence of events there, it just doesn't really mesh well in my mind that he would go through the steps of finalizing a will to take care of his estate, but not lay in place procedures and material to deal with the business he was operating in the event something happened. And as well, like, just to kind of speak to India, you know, and I don't mean any offense to anybody watching from India. You know, every country has corruption to some degree, but India can be a very corrupt country given the high amount of poverty there and the size of the population. And, you know, being somebody who died in India, as has been reported, it's not crazy or outside of the realm of reason that it's possible that the death certificate from India is not genuine. that it's something that could have been forged or paid for illegitimately. And there are actually videos on YouTube you can look up of people proving, even in a developed country or a more developed country like America, how easy it is to buy a fake death certificate. And then the basis upon which a death certificate was issued in Canada, the same thing kind of follows. With one from India, the process to getting a fake one in Canada would be a lot easier and simpler. And it's ultimately just, I don't want to come out and say that definitively that this man has faked his death and ran off with everybody's Bitcoin, but it is absolutely not outside the realm of reason that that has happened. And then on the other side here, like, you know, looking at this as a legitimate security screw up for the company, they have said previously that they use multi-sig to secure their cold storage. Like Quadriga, the company, publicly has stated this. And so to look at one laptop being encrypted and inaccessible to everybody else in the company, this brings a lot of questions, like how exactly was the multi-signature setup constructed and managed? Because really there's only two ways I can see losing access to one laptop would make the entire cold storage wallet inaccessible. And that's either one, the multi-sig was N of N instead of an M of N setup that only required a subset of the keys to sign, which would be an unbelievably just foolish and stupid way to set up a security mechanism for a company like that, where just a single fuck up like this brings the entire company down and loses access to all of its customers' funds. Or despite having an M of N setup, all or most of the keys were managed by one person, in which case you're kind of losing all of the benefits here of distributing control. And so, like, if this is just a genuine, like, they have lost access, like, nobody is pulling any kind of exit scam or shadiness here, like, well, that is just a monumental fuck up in terms of, you know, the architecture of security for that company. And Chris is showing here on the screen right now, Jesse Powell from Kraken actually has a large number of Quadriga's addresses correlated just because of interactions between customers on both exchanges moving money between them. And he's actually offering these addresses to, I think, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police if they were to go through the process of getting a warrant. Just to kind of look into this because of how suspicious it is. And he's not going to release them publicly until some kind of communication with the police and more information comes to light. But, you know, this, at the very least, seeing these addresses should be able to show us what kind of multi-sig key setup was used by the company. Looking at any cold address that has been spent from before, because it will reveal the script and show how many keys in total, how many you're required to spend, and kind of give us a definitive answer as to how their cold storage was architected, just at least in design, if not how those keys were distributed from people. But, you know, ultimately, and also in the show notes, there are two entities in the Samurai wallet, Block Explorer OXT, that Laurent believes are associated with Quadriga cold storage, as the activity in them ceased pretty much around the time of the CEO's death. But like there's really just like two different ways to look at it and not enough information to make a definitive answer. And in one of them, it would show that, you know, even with the biggest company, something with an established reputation, it's very, very difficult to prevent somebody from just kind of creating a convoluted situation to distract from things and running off with all the money. Or two, it's very possible to architect the security of your storage system in a way where it is not actually resilient to data loss, to security compromise, or any kind of mishap that would prevent access from those funds and pretty much take the entire company and all of its customers' money down with it. And I mean, you know, regardless of how this really plays out in the long term and what new information comes to light shows, I mean, it's still either way a very important lesson in this space, that how you manage crypto assets is very, very important the larger a scale that management gets. And I mean, it's not something that should just be slapped together willy-nilly. Like, this is a very complex scripting system that has a large degree of freedom relative to the legacy financial system and how assets can be secured. And a lot of care and thought should be put into how you do that, because like the more your business grows, the more important and the more edge cases and threats you need to actually, you know, set your system up to be resilient against. All right, rant done.
Very, very interesting. There's a lot of people that are very sensitive about this story that are like, you know, he's dead and you should have some respect and don't do or say anything. And it's like, well, I would hope if anything like this that was weird happened to anybody in the space, that there would be enough eyes to look at and to make sure that what people said happened did happen, whether it's malfeasance or whether it's knowing what happened to people's money. The object of journalism isn't to be some, you know, PR fountain where everybody gets to hear these happy-go-lucky rants about stuff that everybody's on board with. It's supposed to look at what our opportunities and our dangers are, and it's supposed to, you know, upset sometimes public opinion. So for anybody that is going to maybe send angry messages like, how dare you look at what's going on in the situation and not just believe what you were told. It's not that we don't have respect for the people that were involved in the situation. It's that, you know, sometimes to explore the truth and go through and ask difficult questions can be offensive to people. And this is one of those situations where it sucks that somebody that seems like he was a really good guy, you know, died, and that he was in India doing orphanage work and stuff like that. But at the same time, there are so many incentives in terms of what's going on here, in terms of people trying to steal, you know, or modify reality to try to get stuff from people. So a lot of these questions need to be asked. And so I guess I wanted to kind of weigh in with that really quick before Chris weighs in. I'm anxious to hear what he has to say as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer my condolences to Ms. Robertson and the family of Mr. Cotton. I don't think we should assume bad faith necessarily, and I would like to point out that this hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's happened because this industry has gone through way too many hacks and scams that people are just feeling very jaded. And I would say that, having spoken to a few people in the banking industry and also an insurance company recently, I sat down, I was invited into this workshop where I was showing this demo of this insurance product where the insurance company was a multi-sig key holder for exchanges, so that they could be insured against theft. And so basically the idea is that first $1,000 worth of your crypto on the exchange is insured. And in order for that to happen, you know, these insurance companies have criminologists and they have actuaries, you know, experts in calculating risk. They are not, you know, they are very familiar with all the different events that could happen, all the different risks and probabilities of things going wrong. And it does strike me as very odd, and I think Shinobi did a really good job of laying out there some of the peculiarities around this story, some of the kind of weirdness of it. Some of these addresses that you were depositing to Quadriga have multi-signature. It kind of begs belief that they would all just be on a single sig, or you know, on a single laptop that was encrypted. That's kind of bizarre. But often, when you're inside of these stories, you can be reading all the speculation on social media and you can see all the news reports, and it's very different to what you're seeing on the inside, because we don't live with perfect information symmetry. It can take a long time for information to come out. So remember that when you're reading these stories, you're reacting to a very two-dimensional aspect. You're not really getting to the details. In time, all the details will come out, but it's very tempting, I think, with the immediacy and the spontaneity of social media, that we just want to get emotional. We see a piece of information and we react to it. And you know, this is my reaction. This is what I think. Oh, what a terrible guy. Oh, that's obviously a scam. Look at all these inconsistencies, and you don't yet have a complete picture of what's going on. And I think that it is about time that some of these exchanges just really grew up. In fact, a lot of these companies in this industry, I think what this industry did, just to round off this thought, is it did lower the barrier to entry into an industry, just like a lot of other internet innovations did, just like MySpace did with music, just like YouTube did with the video, just like, you know, all these innovations. The librarian, Google, you know, Google killed the librarian. I mean, what a shame. And Bitcoin came along and it said, look, anyone can take part in finance if they want to. Here's a really, you know, simple protocol, but it's very dangerous. You know, it's got some really, really sharp edges. You can really hurt yourself, and you could hurt other people if you don't build on top of it in the right way. And I think because we had an influx of a lot of amateurs, and I mean amateur like amour, I mean, amateur doesn't mean that you're bad at something. It comes from the word love. It means the love of something. Because we had people coming into the industry who had a love for it or an enthusiasm for finance, but didn't necessarily have the credentials or the right kind of credentials for the right reasons, hadn't learned the right life lessons, just were not in a good, responsible place in their lives where they were able to look after other people's funds safely. That has led to a lot of these, you know, mistakes. I think a lot of them have been hacks, but I think there also has been a lot of negligence, and negligence and malice together are just a horrible combination, because then you're really not sure what to believe. So I'm not going to jump to the conclusion that it's an exit scam, because I believe there's more information that we're not being told, and when it comes out, the fuller picture, just like it is with Mt. Gox right now, will become clear. So I'm going to reserve judgment for now.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, still to kind of speak a bit to that more skeptical side, I mean, these are issues to consider and always keep in the back of your mind. I mean, especially with, you know, things like back down the line, with some things going on in Germany we're going to cover later, in these ETFs, you know, down the pipeline. Institutional scale money is coming. And the more that pot of money, or each individual pot of money grows, I mean, the more incentive you have for nefarious things like that, where somebody inside of a company might be motivated to try and concoct some elaborate situation like this and try to disappear into the wind with billions of dollars that nobody can stop them from using. And I mean, that's something you always have to be vigilant about. But from the other side, you know, again, not jumping to conclusions, one of the things in the show notes is a link to a Reddit thread on our Litecoin, where people were screaming that their Litecoin cold storage is moving, and this proves this is a scam. And if you really look at the things that were being used to justify those statements, it was one of their Litecoin hot wallets, and them simply tracing deposits of large amounts to other Litecoin addresses. And you can see in these addresses that they are constantly active despite having thousands or tens of thousands of Litecoin. And in context, it's quite clearly simply whales wallets that regularly trade on the exchange, and these addresses are way too active to be cold storage for an institution like that. Like, they're making large transactions very regularly, but, you know, still, despite being large transactions, amounts much too small for top-offs from cold storage. And it's just, the pattern doesn't fit. But people seized on that and immediately jumped to the conclusion that the lost keys are a lie. Like, this proves that we're being scammed right now.
Yeah, it's important to look through all these things and to make sure that you're trying to use as much empirical information as you can find, and then make a decision for yourself based on logic. And I mean, we kind of have a standard of reacting like this to these types of things. A while ago, I mean, forever ago in Bitcoin time, but BitPay made a big error with internal governance mistakes. They got socially engineered to send a lot of money via an email request. I remember I was on the Bitcoin group, and I talked about this and about the internal governance and monetary transfer regulations at Fortune 50 banks, because I had done math-based security project management for those types of institutions, and those policies should have been copied over to BitPay, and they weren't. And so then they were trying to make it so that they could get bailed out by the insurance company. I thought that more of an investigation should be done before they just got bailed out by an insurance company for something that they called a hack, which is really a social engineer. But it's I didn't make any friends saying that, but again, it's we kind of have this tradition of when something happens and you're given, you know, an answer in terms of what's going on. If the community's money is involved in that, certain people are going to take as deep a look as possible into trying to figure out exactly what happened. Is what they said happened what happened? Where are the funds? Can we trace where the funds have gone and try to, you know, figure out who got them? Was it an inside job? There's just so many questions to ask when you get down into the minutia of Bitcoin is a bearer asset with one-way transfer. All types of stuff can happen in terms of, we're used to the legacy system where transaction reversals are possible. You can, you know, discourage people from wanting to steal because it's going to get stolen back from, you know, their coffers. And then also, you know, there's just a whole myriad of reasons that, you know, one-way transfer makes it so that security becomes difficult. And
well, it's not. In the legacy system, I've asked bankers about this, about the reversibility of transactions, and they said, well, look, the way the banking system was built, it was built very slowly, gradually over time, and bits and pieces got built on top of each other. You've got lots of legacy code in the financial system. You know, some joke about COBOL. I don't know that it's still that way in many places, but that was certainly true like 10 years ago when I was hanging out in Canary Wharf in London. But actually, a lot of transactions, particularly international payments using the banking system, I'm not talking about Visa, I'm talking bank-to-bank transfers, they are irreversible. You do need a judge to compel a business into doing something. And a lot of banks nowadays, even in the UK where we have faster payments, same-day payments, a lot of banks will insist on a court order before they reverse a transaction because they simply don't want to get involved in the dispute.
Yes, I agree, but it is possible.
Yes, but the thing is, it's also theoretically possible with Bitcoin. You can compel the owner of an address if you know who it is. The difference with the bank system is you know who owns that account. That was baked into the system from the get-go, the identity. But now we're reaching certain morally hazardous situations where we're realizing that tying someone's legal identity to their money has implications, as if we shouldn't have learned that in World War II by now. But we are now realizing that it's fine if, you know, if you're part of a nice government and you're in the West, but what if you're in Saudi Arabia? What if you're in Iran? And now all of a sudden it doesn't seem like such a good idea to be tying people's legal identity to everything that they spend it on. And, yeah.
Absolutely. Very well said.
Shinobi getting a drink?
Okay,
Yeah, I'm back. But,
Shinobi getting liquored up with his flask as per usual.
But you know what you said about BitPay, you know, and people jumping into conclusions of Blake. Like in the end, that turned out to be an internal fuck up and a lack of solid procedures internal to the company. And I mean, that's, you know, that's exactly the point here, and like why I kind of went over things the way I did. It's like I personally think that these things all look very suspicious put together, but I mean, that's still like, I don't have any more special information than anybody else. I just have my opinion after looking at it, and I can't state that as a certainty. Like, that's just my opinion, and I can't really claim that as fact until a lot more things come out and I have actual new information to really like pull in to my assessment. But I don't know. Unless there's any more comments here, I think Janine has a report to go over that should be pretty entertaining.
Anybody?
I was just going to add, go with the facts, try to read the facts. And if you're going to confabulate and try to make up what happened, try to do that in a way that is focused around managing risk for people that are involved. And I think that as long as you're talking about fact as fact, and if you're trying to, you know, come up with theories about what might be possible, make sure that you cut those two things into separate pieces, and you should be fine.
Alrighty, so the next story is about more of this Bitcoin is going to kill the planet and destroy the environment claims. So this is a topic we've talked about a number of times on Block Digest. The times we've talked about it are episodes 81, 121, and 136. And also we did a special edition episode with Jonathan Bertrand about this as well, because there's always tons of terrible press coverage in this area, and there's been increasing interest among people in Bitcoin to actually start gathering useful data and drawing more realistic projections and conclusions about where the electricity used to mine Bitcoin is sourced. So most of the prominent sources of bad data and extrapolations is, as you may know, Digiconomist, which we brought up a few times in discussing this topic, because basically every mainstream news article, even some, obscure and not actually studies, academic studies, have used Digiconomist as a source for their claims about Bitcoin. And someone by the name of Robert Charrett, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, published a Medium post on January 29th that was criticizing a lot of the fallacies that he found in Digiconomist, some of which I've seen before and some of which I hadn't noticed before. If you don't know, Digiconomist is actually a 20-ish year old named Alex DeVries, I think how he pronounced his name. And he uses a lot of misleading sourcing tactics, as well as over exaggerating what he has actually proved with the stuff that he has on his website. So for some reason, I just want to point out, I saw Frances Coppola, our favorite I Know More Than You Do in the Bitcoin community, or outside the Bitcoin community. She was laughing at the fact that that this guy started off by describing himself as having a background in electricity from when I was an investment banker, which, yes, I can agree that sounds a bit weird on its face, because that doesn't sound like a conventional, related career path. But if she had actually taken the time to read the rest of this paragraph, which I think is probably not more than 100 to 200 words, he explains that he worked in a natural resources and power group for about 8 years and modeled electricity systems and assets in the UK and China in the context of acquisitions, capital raisings, restructurings, and regulatory submissions. One of the banks he worked for was HSBC in their emerging markets M&A team. And he says he's familiar with China because I guess part of their business was there. And he says the financial models were built using statistical software to apply distribution shape to inputs. When I left investment banking, I purchased with some partners an electricity business in Italy that had an 8 run-of-river hydro plants and 2 CCGT facilities. I don't know what that acronym stands for, if anyone knows. So I don't know about you guys, but that seems like an actually realistic career path where investment banking and, energy systems would converge. It doesn't sound like bullshit, but I'm not familiar with the guy. And it's a pretty long Medium post, but in summary, he points out several of the problems, not only in how Alex has gathered the data and extrapolated it, but also in some predictions that he has made previously about Bitcoin's energy use, which have now passed their due date and did not come true as we expected. But also problems in how he presents the data on Digiconomist as being peer-reviewed, when in fact he is only, he cites articles or papers which cite his work as supporting evidence, but themselves did not independently challenge any of his claims, which, that is not peer review just because you get cited somewhere. For example, the study, which wasn't actually a study that we talked about in episode 136, cited his article in order to back up their assertions about energy consumption, which they did not challenge at all. And it turns out that none of the authors of that comment paper from a university in Hawaii even had relevant experience. Sherratt writes, the lead author of that comment paper has a degree in biology, works in the geography department, and his specialty is, quote, how biodiversity patterns are generated and modified by human activities. That part sounds kind of relevant, maybe. But then there are 6 other authors, all of which have backgrounds ranging from tropical plant and soil science to botany. None of them have experience in power markets, cryptography, or computer science. And one of the funniest errors he points out is where Alex claims that, quote, there are 500 million people who might be mining Bitcoin without even knowing it. And then says that he doesn't actually, include miners who do that in his calculations when he's talking about how much energy is used. Yet elsewhere in his blog, he says the only way to mine Bitcoin today is by using specialized mining equipment like an Antminer S9. And he says, I don't have an Antminer S9 at home, at least I don't think I do, but I understand that they are about the size of a small refrigerator and throw out a fair bit of heat. I think that 500 million people might notice that. Towards the end of the piece, he writes, to our friends in the environmental movement, know this, crypto is not your enemy. You know well what it is like to have misinformation used against you. And so that was basically the points that stood out to me. But what I noticed on Twitter is that this article debunking some of Digiconomist's work was apparently so enraging and illegitimate to those who still believe that Bitcoin will kill the planet that people like Tim Swanson decided to take a break from my paternity leave to say that you could independently ascertain the real environmental impact by dividing the hash rate of a coin by the most common mining equipment. First of all, that sounds like a really weird fraction. But it's also absolutely not true at all, because doing so would completely ignore the biggest aspect of this whole debate, which is where is the electricity sourced from and how is it generated? And only then can you even begin to think about what the environmental impact is. And of course, one of the things he brings up in this article, which is he acknowledges that hydropower is not necessarily always clean energy, like we often refer to it as that, but that also has environmental impact, not as big as other sources, but it does have environmental impact. And so all of that has to be considered in this. But, you know, it just keeps coming up and people keep making the same assumptions and sharing this misinformation. There was even a conference in Berlin, I think a week or two ago, where one of the presentations mentioned, like, you know, we have to build sustainable blockchains that don't destroy the planet. And I didn't really get a response back when I tried to correct that. So it's a pretty prevalent misconception, and it's really sad. So I feel like we have to keep bringing it up. Otherwise, people don't even know that it's debated.
Very interesting. It's almost like when people write these equations or make these conclusions, they're suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect, wherein like the less experienced you are, the more confident you are, and the more experienced you are, the less confident you are. Like somebody that actually had a lot of experience in multiple generations of mining, multiple different coins, different areas where energy and cooling are different, you know, costs and stuff like that, they would know of the huge variables in terms of trying to figure this stuff out. But somebody that comes in, you know, all cocky and, you know, kind of with a low information standpoint, like it's funny how they come out like this is the exact thing. And it's always funny to see people do that in specifically this space, because it's like, oh boy, you're definitely going to get a reaction from people, because that's what we do.
No more ad hominems, no more Dunning-Krugers. We mention those two way too often, Blake. Come on.
I love it.
We've got to diversify. We've got to diversify.
The people who wrote all of these reports are retards. Okay, now we can.
That's an ad hominem again.
Wait, no. They're subtarded. Remember, that's not nice to retarded people.
They're subtarded. They're subtarded.
This on my screen right now. This is going to kill us all. That's what I have to mention every time someone talks about the environment. There's no such thing as environmentally friendly. There is only less environmentally dangerous. And the reason this keeps coming up, as a topic with crypto is because the perception, just ostensibly, you think about all the mining, you learn about it for the first time, you learn about this thing called mining, people try to get their heads around it, you can see them thinking, and so there's this mathematical problem that's really, really hard, it's computationally difficult, everyone has to do it, they're in some kind of race condition, and of course you start to think of, you know, power consumption, because you're told that there's an economic cost to the miner, that everyone has to engage in this, but their minds don't automatically jump to, and this provides a utility by securing the network from fraud. In other words, that the overall output, if we could measure it, let's say, that number would be correlated with the total, you know, the actual amount of human fraud. And that those two things are bound together, that we need this somehow. So first of all, they miss the utility. That is not immediately obvious unless someone explains it to you. And so I don't agree with this author in particular that it's all about this one guy's paper. I'm sure that journalists have been citing him, but journalists do this all the time. The journalists are typically these days not in the habit of checking sources thoroughly. They're only really my experience, direct experience, I might add, interested in checking that a story is prima facie true. That means on the face of it, they check a source. And even if, I mean, I've seen journalists source their own publications and their own work. So it just becomes circular, right? So now they're just sourcing themselves, saying a thing. And what they're relying on is that most people don't check the footnotes. Most people don't go through and try to see where that piece of information came from. So I accept the author, Robert Sherratt, I've read the post today before the show. I accept that a lot of journalists in the space may be sourcing this original guy, Alex de Vries. What I don't accept is that this comes from him, because when I first got into crypto, I went to some meetups, some like experimental, economic theory, some meetups in London where, there was like positive money. Some of you from the UK might be familiar. They actually think that you should abolish money altogether. I was interested in different ways of thinking, even people that were completely at the other end of the spectrum. And
I'm sorry, abolish money completely.
Yeah, yes, there are people that have all kinds of batshit ideas. There are 7 billion of these critters, these fucking humanoid people on the planet. You're going to come across a few crazies every now and again. But anyway, they had this idea, and I met a guy there who was one of these people who thought, you should get rid of money, but he was also an environmental scientist. He was like a proper credentialed doctor. And he was telling me, yeah, I did some research into the power consumption of Bitcoin, and I actually ended up coming to the conclusion that it was, right now, obviously a lot less environmentally damaging than the banking system if you account for. And it's really about inclusion in your model. A model that doesn't include is a broken model. So you can slice the cake any way you want. You can make it come out any way you want just by modifying the inputs slightly and tweaking them and saying, well, I'm not going to include all the skyscrapers in downtown, and I'm not going to include all the backup systems, and I'm not going to include all the other stuff. But he was quite generous when he didn't have to be. And he was saying, for now, it is less environmentally damaging than the banking system. But he did fear that eventually it could end up becoming, a problem, because he said that the difficulty adjustment was unbounded. It wasn't regulated. And so it could just keep getting, more and more difficult for the mining. And there were no natural regulations there. I think there are, though, because obviously the costs of the power would go up over time. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Satoshi did mention this in the early forum post. There was a conversation before my time, but I read it, about how mining would naturally drift into places like Iceland and places where there were more economic sources of energy. So the incentives, the incentives are there. I think the basic model is there, but then you have to account for lots of noise and anomalies, things that are hard to predict in a social, system, like corruption, issues. Particularly this chap Sherratt talks about China. I've got lots of anecdotal, evidence from how the people who were mining in China were bribing local officials. Eventually, they got shut down. There was all this kind of complications. So I think that this reminds me of the conversations that you get in the precious metals market, where you get all these gold bugs who have all this research that says that such and such country is like hoarding lots of gold. But ultimately, when you start to probe and you look at the sources of the information, it starts to fall apart quite quickly. So that's what this would fall into, that category for me.
Yeah, I mean, some of the ridiculous assumptions I've seen made in like these kind of attacks on proof of work are just like, this is how much mining hash power there is, raw conversion to electricity, and that's all carbon emissions. And like they ignore like all of the factors in like, does this energy source have carbon emissions? Like, do hydro dams create carbon emissions? Does geothermal power in Iceland make carbon emissions? And it's like, no, like they're not actually looking at the data and continuing to break it down into categories to look at the properties of externalities each of those have. It's just like a kid doing a math problem in second grade. Like, this number translates to this number bad. And like,
let's stick on that point. That's exactly correct. The problem with this conversation in general is it should start with our assumptions. It should begin with what we include in the model, and it shouldn't just jump to all the emotive stuff, because ultimately what this boils down to is the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy will kill us all. There will be a heat death. I mean, of all the laws, I'm not a physicist, but of what I understand, this is like the one law of thermodynamics we're the most sure about, right? Is that in an isolated system, entropy tends to only increase, right? And as a result, it's going to kill us all. So really, it's trade-offs. And you have to think about, well, is it worth it for me? Are the security benefits that I get from the Bitcoin network worth it to me for this thermodynamic output that will do something to the environment on this planet? It's hard for us to predict, but we get the general gist of where this is going.
And didn't we discuss this, like one of the first times that we met at Porkfest when we were camping? We talked about an entropy like garbage cleaning system and how Bitcoin represents an entropy garbage cleaning system because it's not this inflationary, redundant scope creep thing.
Yeah.
There's a singular chain that's going to categorize things as they should be categorized and make a counter-entropic, almost godlike ledger of what different people are doing, when and why and where, and it can actually reduce the amount of repeated and wasted effort. It will decrease the amount of diffusion in human action. It's funny to get down to the absolute base places of what type of value is offered by Bitcoin, because it's like all the most valuable stuff that we weren't able to achieve before because our fault tolerance, computer science ability wasn't high enough to be able to say, okay, we can all now agree on this, and now that we can agree on this, we can actually become less entropic and export entropy outside of the system, and we can actually correct a lot of the systems with really bad wacky shit.
Like a life form where I can create neg entropy inside of my body in a kind of a system of order, but then of course overall the net, you know, if you account for everything, all the electron volts emitted, I'm producing more than I'm.
And so then we say that you're exporting entropy because it's good for you. There's more entropy overall, but then you become something that's almost a staple to more measurable and less entropic things, which is extrapolating that to its logical conclusions, like over as much, you know, theory as you could, would take almost forever. I mean, that's such a huge thing to chew over that it fascinates me. It's one of the primary rabbit holes of Bitcoin. And if we arrange human action in a very specific way, like what becomes possible from there. And I love trying to wrap my Bitcoin thoughts around that cypherpunk ideology of, if we're moving all of this trustlessness in this direction to try to export entropy, how do we do that and what does that look like? And I think that people thinking on that level is really helpful for the philosophy of the science that then goes into Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, to put things a little simpler, like it's just taking wasted energy that is creating externalities and putting it to the purpose of that oracle of truth. And I mean, you have that like inner boundary, like the actual Bitcoin itself, where it is that absolute truth, but that time stamping function can extend that truth even further to a lesser and lesser degree the more you move outside of that bound. Like it can still commit and prove the existence of other things, it just can't prove their absolute truthfulness in the same way, but it can still prove a relative truth, like this assertion was made or this thing was recorded.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not as strong of a contradiction canceller.
If an alien species came along and found a copy of the blockchain later on, it would have an internal consistency. Is that what you mean? You wouldn't have to see what it was derived from, but you could tell that it was true because mathematics is universal, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One of the other things that I think gets ignored a lot is that people who think Bitcoin is wasteful or that energy used to mine Bitcoin is wasteful is that they leave out the part where a lot of the mining occurs in areas where that electricity generated would be wasted for various reasons. Either it just can't be distributed, there isn't a good enough distribution network, or there's too much being generated in that area to match the demand. And I think I even saw a map a few days ago where it mapped out the major mining operations in China, and it just happened to be in the areas in China where there is a high discrepancy between like a low demand, high supply energy network. So that makes sense to me.
You can almost do energy arbitrage, and it's like it's actually another value system, right? Like you can actually extract energy from where it's too concentrated and then move the value around.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really like it is just such a fundamental like addition to tools as far as society goes that like to just dismiss it is absolutely absurd, because like just the financial aspect of what it can provide is such a giant leap forward in how economic coordination has happened. But like just that foundation existing creates the potential of so much more use beyond that financial aspect. It just requires that bedrock to keep the entire system stable, to continue building other functionalities or uses on top of it.
Got to have a base layer, got to have a foundation.
Mm-hmm. But is any more input on this one before we slide along?
This is why these two stories that we've covered so far point to the reason why I took a back seat on social media, because I just really got fed up with the emotional reactions to all of this information. Even that blog post that we featured there from Hacker Noon, like it's a well-written piece, and I think underlying it, just addressing the underlying points, I think that's sound. He eventually does get to citations, but also early on in the post, he does, speak from anecdotes. Talks about his personal experiences, talking to people in China, for example. And this is the reason why I kind of, took a, hiatus from all this stuff, because it was just so emotionally draining to deal with all this temporary information. Temporary, you're creating a judgment based on imperfect information. Even really before, because you can't have perfect, but even before you've really got a full picture. And this is something Heidegger called the informal indication, the formal indication, which is when you first come across an object, the first thing you see is almost always incorrect and untrue, that you have to spend time with that object before you can really get underneath it and through it. And the fact that people are not quick to reserve judgment on social media, the fact that they're so reactionary and impulsive, and the whole ephemerality, it's ephemeral, but it isn't as well, because everything does get stored, in massive server farms, and how long that will be persisted, we don't know. I mean, that's going to care, that will depend on the amount of care and the amount of energy that the controllers of that information wish to dispense with. But that for me, that contrast, that weird contrast of this ephemeral, emotional, reactive, but then getting persisted and stored and logged with, all of your identity bound up with it, just for me felt quite, I hate to use the word, Shinobi, but toxic.
Toxic.
Get the Britney Spears song ready.
Toxie, the Avenger, the Toxic Avenger. It's Toxie.
I haven't seen that movie in probably more than a decade.
Best worst movie ever made.
All right, though, we ready to slide along? All right. So next up is some pretty awesome news, I would say. Casa has decided to open source all of the code for their Casa node in the first step of slowly open sourcing all of the code for their different products and platforms that are what they say trust critical. So the things involved in actual management of money and private information and so on. And they've decided to start with the node, as obviously this is kind of the bedrock of using Bitcoin if you choose to purchase this from them. Like that is what is validating your money, you're actually looking to as an oracle of the blockchain. And so obviously that makes a lot of sense to start there. So they've pretty much open sourced the API that functions as middleware between their dashboard and the actual node software. They've open sourced the dashboard, the node manager that actually configures and launches the Docker instances that actually contain the node software for Bitcoin and Lightning Network, as well as the updater software, which I think is probably one of the most important things. So you can actually verify the process of updating through them and see that it's not going to just start grabbing software without user approval, or that it's actually getting things from appropriate sources. and they have put all of this under the MIT license. Although obviously their name, their logo, and anything to do with the corporate brand is still copyright of them. But I think they found like a nice medium here between being a company that's actually building a product and trying to kind of keep things open source and in line with the overall Bitcoin ethos. So effectively what they're doing is they're going to be maintaining this public repository of what's actually operating as the current version of software on a Casa node. And then they're going to be maintaining private repos for actual development. So they will have a private development branch, a private release branch where they merge things into the current release, a private master branch, and then the public master branch. And so the overall development workflow is going to be people working on these private branches, pushing to the development forks to protect their developers and employees' identities and private information. Have the release branches and pretty much have patches merged backwards, and then eventually push into the private master branch. And then when that has hit the point of release, they'll simply merge that into the public master repo in one push, kind of obscuring all of the individual, commits and pull requests, and not revealing any of the actual private information of people at the company working on it. And then they're also going to accept public pull requests through the public repo. So despite all of their internal developments and employees being kept private, they will have a process where they will look at code contributions from the public and merge them into the public master branch. So they have kind of like isolated things where all of their internal development processes are kept private to protect their employees, to allow them to kind of actually develop new features and functionalities in private without that being publicly known until they're finished and ready and merged into the public branch. And I think this is a really nice balance between, like I said, a company building a product, but given the ecosystem they're in, keeping things public and auditable so that you don't effectively have to completely trust this private entity for everything you're using their products for. And they're also going to be working on a function using Git checkout so that you can actually verify on their device that you are running the code on that device that they have posted in the public repo. And also, they're going to be creating a bug bounty program. So for any kind of responsible disclosure of bugs, they will be paying out bounties. And this, again, is, that nice balance between public and private. Like, they're able to maintain themselves as a company with a product, but still have the benefits of having the code open sourced and eyes outside of the company being able to find bugs or assist with security issues that they find. And, a lot of you might be asking, well, why the hell would I actually buy a Casa node if I can just download the software? Well, that kind of comes into who you are as an individual. Like, I mean, myself, I will probably never buy this device, and I might look into actually running the software, but not everybody is comfortable building software themselves or even capable of doing that. And ultimately, it just comes down to a market. I mean, there are a number of things that large groups of people will just do themselves, and other groups of people will simply buy a product to accomplish it because they don't want to take the time or have the skill sets to do something themselves. I mean, there are plenty of people in the world that will do things as far as home improvement projects themselves, but you still have carpenters, you still have painters that make money doing things for somebody. So, I think there will still be people buying these nodes who just don't have the skill set or time to do this. But the way they've done this, if you do want to devote the time, you can simply construct your own and use the open source software now. but if not, they're still there with this product available to simply purchase and plug in. And so I think, you know, they've struck a really nice balance, you know, overall between this, because, you know, we should want as many people running a node as possible. And for those who are in a situation where the barriers to doing that completely by themselves are, you know, too high, here's a solution for this. And buying a node from them instead of making your own, you also get access to tech support through them. So that is even yet again another incentive for people who don't have the time or these skill sets to simply just buy the node, because you will actually have people who can help walk you through troubleshooting things instead of just being left to your own devices to figure things out.
Market powered support.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, it is what it is. Like, you know, Bitcoin is something that encourages personal responsibility, but it doesn't enforce it. And by its very nature, it can't. So, I mean, like there really is nothing wrong with things like this that try to assist people in taking responsibility for things. I mean, the world isn't black or white. It's not a polar binary. Like most things are a spectrum. And I think this is a net positive to have something that tries to give people control and responsibility as much as it can, where they otherwise would just abdicate that responsibility completely.
Yeah, and I mean, I really liked your point about it's like market powered support. Like if you go into forums and stuff like that and you're asking people questions and it's not working out, but you bought hardware from, you know, a Bitcoin hardware company, and you can actually contact them for one-on-one support that you know probably couldn't get elsewhere. I mean, unless maybe you tipped Bitcoin, but then, you know, who are you tipping? Did you give money to somebody that told you to, you know, mix up some, you know, poison gas in the bathroom to help you make super cleaning chemicals? You don't know sometimes who you're buying advice from on Reddit. So again, I don't know. I think having the established company which can provide some type of support, there's a certain type of consumer that I think that's definitely a value proposition that stands up.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Chris, what's our resident node advocate's position on this?
Yeah, you summed up really well. They're not saying that, they're not inviting users to compile and install it themselves. They make a lot of fuss in this post talking about how difficult that will be and how labor intensive. But at the bottom, I highlighted it as you were speaking, is that, yeah, you know, you can say, look, this widget that I made is completely open source. You can read the 500,000 lines of C code all by yourself. It's just not very realistic, and it's disingenuous, and it's not honest. So I think that Casa has tried to strike a nice balance here. There are already DIY nodes out there. My project notwithstanding that it's very aged now, there are newer projects and people that are doing it. They're just doing this for transparency purposes. They want people to check their work, which is super important. There is not enough auditing going on in this space. I think a lot of fuss is made around trustlessness, but actually trust is a very important component in civilization. The fact that it doesn't scale very well is, of course, a problem that Bitcoin seeks to address, but not by getting rid of trust. Actually, on the contrary, I think that Bitcoin and crypto makes trust more important, as we are learning with all of these revelations around hacks and various scandals and so on. So if anything, Bitcoin for me just really reveals our true nature to ourselves, particularly at scale. You have to remember that the internet is probably the biggest change in human interaction that we've ever seen before. And we've lived right through it. And particularly me, I think Blake, I don't know about you, Shinobi, I don't know how old you are, but I was born in 1980. So I did witness the transition from the analog telephone to the digital telephone, the cellular network, into the internet. I lived through that. I've lived through a very important, I don't know your age. He's telling
I know what a modem sounds like, you little whippersnapper.
Do you even remember life before the internet? Come on. Do you remember CDs? Do you remember cassette tapes?
I do.
Of course I do.
Yeah.
I was ripping wave to MP3 while you were at your mother's teat.
Yeah. So I don't think there's enough auditing. There's not enough people checking one another's work. And I think this fallback argument of, well, you know, what does an audit mean anyway? What do even credentials mean? I mean, people can fake that. Well, yeah, all of this stuff. But you have to understand that there's a web of trust involved in any community. And, you know, insurers, for example, I mean, essentially what is insurance is people sharing the risk together. It's people understanding that they share a common risk and they're all putting some money in. But that insurer is not there to sort of front your sort of scam operation. It's not there where, you know, you're negligent, you're not hiring the right people, you're not sourcing the right talent for your organization. And then when something goes wrong and people lose money, you turn around and go, oh, well, you know, mistakes happen. I mean, how can you trust anyone? I mean, this kind of argument just grinds me down, but you get it a lot in this industry, a lot of hand waving and a lot of excusing, a lot of forgiveness. There's a lot of self-forgiveness without really doing the painful work of growing, which, by the way, is not a choice. You don't get to choose whether you do it in life. You either grow or you die. And I don't think there's enough of that. And I like what Casa are doing right there. I think that struck the right balance for me.
It's interesting too because of trust and care. Again, when we first met, we started talking about care and levels of care and incentive and skin in the game. We were talking a lot about skin in the game before. I think a lot of people were talking about skin in the game. So it's interesting when you talk about trust. I think that you're right. When we talk about trustlessness in Bitcoin, we're talking about specifically the act of settlement should be trustless, and we should keep that trustless. And then when people say, you know, let's throw baby and bathwater named trust out the window all at the same time, it's like, whoa, like let's not do that at all. Like trust is extremely important, and you can set up situations where trust is incentivized or it's checked or it's the risk is diffused a little bit more. Like there's ways to handle trust. And you're right, when people just start talking about, you know, what are the buzzwords? Oh, trustless and decentralized, and they just keep trying to push those two words forward without having them connected with anything meaningful, has just become almost really, really cringeworthy, to the point where like I'll flush with embarrassment when I see people just, you know, firing those words out without knowing exactly where trust minimization in Bitcoin exactly meet up, and then where else you're going to actually need strong you know, trust relationships with people that, you know, straddle the Bitcoin trustless situation, specifically exchanges and stuff like that. So again, when people just say trustless and they try to throw trust out the window, it's just kind of like, oh no.
No.
No, you gotta say it like Carlos Matos.
Oh no.
No.
The world is not the way it once was. No.
But yeah, it's I don't know. I'm just overall glad to see them actually open sourcing everything here. And you know, honestly, really, I think the only real incentive to build this yourself, I would see, is access to the dashboard. You know, it's kind of similar to Pierre Rochard's node launcher. And I really think like that is a big part of what makes things like this attractive to less technical people, is that front end aspect that really just abstracts all of the minutia out of managing software like this. Like it's just launch it, it's running, here is the bare bones simple dashboard to manage it that I need. And like ultimately I fully expect somebody out there to kind of take this, you know, dashboard and the API and hack it a little bit so that you can just directly drop this on top of a normal node and not have to worry about Docker instance configuration and all of that.
One of my favorite videos on the internet is Hitler uses Docker. If I'm not mistaken, they go out and they use a whole bunch of custom containers that they didn't program, and then they put them all into production. And Hitler gets really angry. So it's pretty funny. It's high quality internet there.
Mm-hmm. But all right, Gene, you want to take us into the next one?
Yeah, speaking of making nodes easier to use or have more functionality, one of the big requests for quite a while in terms of updates to the Bitcoin core, I don't even know what a core is. Bitcoin Core client has been enabling direct integration with hardware wallets, and it's been possible for a long time to integrate hardware wallets with like the Electrum wallet and personal server, which can then connect to a personal node running Bitcoin Core in order to do broadcasting and receiving of transactions that are self-verified on your own node, but also have usable and secure key storage, which that aspect has not been advised as a use case for Bitcoin Core for a while now. But the good news is Bitcoin Core contributor Andrew Chow tweeted on January 30th that his hardware wallet interface that he's been working on was moved from his personal account to the Bitcoin Core GitHub organization, though he is still the maintainer of that. And this has not been merged into any kind of release branch yet. It's too early, but it is currently in I think it's a staging repository that's managed by several of the top Bitcoin Core contributors like Vladimir and those people. But I assume that this is a signal that integration between Bitcoin Core and hardware wallets is being given more consideration, and maybe something that we see coming up soon in terms of a release date. According to the README page of the interface, he says that this interface will support integration with Ledger Nano S, Trezor One, Digital Bitbox, KeepKey, and the Cold Card, and most of the functionality of each of those, I think, is checked off as being ready to go. First, though, the integration will require a few changes being made to Bitcoin Core, as was discussed in pull request number 14565, which is by Peter Wool, number 14491, which is by Samuel Dobson, aka Mesh Collider, who became the lead maintainer for the wallet aspect of Bitcoin Core in December, pull request 14021, and pull request number 14075, which are both by Andrew Chow himself. So there are some changes that need to be added to Bitcoin Core first before this could work, but it doesn't sound like they're too serious or too difficult. So hopefully we'll see this in the next year or so, because that would make it a lot easier than having to figure out, connecting hardware wallets to Electrum, then connecting Electrum to Bitcoin Core node.
You know what? My cold card. I don't need this stupid plugin because I can just take a partially signed Bitcoin transaction right from Core and sign it on my device. Oh!
Nobody likes a gloater.
Diggity diggity.
But yeah, this is like a push to Core that has been talked about and requested for a very long time. So I would be pretty happy to see this merged sometime in the near future. I think aside from just all of the data costs and issues with running a node, one of the big disincentives for actually using it for a lot of people is they want that extra security for key management that comes with a hardware device. And that's kind of like, well, right now that means I can't use a node because I can't use that device with a node. And they're going to prioritize that key security over, the security that comes from actually fully validating things. Cricket. Alrighty.
Yep.
So are we ready to laugh, to cry, to call this next thing one of the stupidest, most pointless ideas involving Bitcoin in this whole ecosystem?
Can we say that the people that are perpetrating this thing are suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect? I think Chris wants us to say that more.
Yes. They are the spitting image of Dunning-Kruger himself.
David Dunning.
No, it's Dunning-Kruger. Okay.
Just make him into one dude.
I know better than you. All right. So I do not recall the episode from the past because I am nowhere near as judicious about this as Janine is. But we covered a while back plans with BitGo, Kyber Network, and Republic Protocol to create a Bitcoin stablecoin. that was called Wrapped BTC and was pretty much an IRC token on Ethereum. And this has officially gone live as of January 31st. And so really, this is kind of a poor man's liquid without the privacy benefits ported onto Ethereum. And I hope after I go over a little bit of the architecture, everybody sees how much of a joke this is. So pretty much the system obviously requires a smart contract on Ethereum to issue and manage the ERC20 token that is the actual Bitcoin stablecoin. And control of this is distributed among all of the merchants that are going to be involved in the system, as well as custodians, in a multi-sig key that is able to add or remove members of that key through functionality in the smart contract. And pretty much the process of interacting with this requires going to one of the merchants as somebody trying to move into the system and going through KYC AML procedures, at which point the merchant will take this token, of which there is a small buffer amount created beyond the supply of Bitcoin held by the custodian, and perform an atomic swap with the merchant to exchange the Bitcoin for the WBTC on the Ethereum chain. And the reverse to cash out. They would exchange the wrapped Bitcoin for the Bitcoin back. Now, as far as the actual issuance of these WBTC tokens, that's controlled by the custodian that is going to hold the Bitcoin. And it's a somewhat similar process between merchants and the custodian without the atomic swap, where a merchant, in order to get new WBTC tokens, initiates with an Ethereum transaction a request for this to the custodian, who would then have to go through their cold storage, get the keys out of that, and create new tokens, and then send it to the merchant after receiving the Bitcoin. And in the reverse, to remove from supply, the merchant would initiate a request for Bitcoins after sending the WBTC tokens. And then after enough confirmations, the custodian would access their cold storage and send Bitcoins back to the merchant. And both of these processes are finalized by the merchant with an Ethereum transaction declaring that the exchange during the minting or burning process has been completed. And why I call this a poor man's liquid is because as of right now, from everything published on this, BitGo is the only custodian. So BitGo effectively has unilateral control over all of the Bitcoins that are actually backed on this. And this is not to say that they will in perpetuity be the only custodian. The model is set up so that multiple custodians can actually engage in the process of minting new WBTC, but nothing in the architecture I've read has explicitly laid out any kind of intent or design to distribute control among multiple custodians for the entire supply, which I think is just a fundamental weakness in the overall custodial aspect of the architecture. Now, as far as the other issue, well, to kind of draw a comparison with Liquid here, in order for something catastrophic to happen on Liquid that would make it impossible for the custodians or the federators in that model to return coins to their rightful owners, you would literally have to break all cryptographic signatures involved in all cryptocurrencies to really completely destroy the ledger of ownership. I mean, obviously, as with anything, individual keys could be compromised and coins stolen, and no real definitive mechanism for proving to the Federation, like, no, these were mine and they were stolen, I should be giving them back or redeemed them on the main Bitcoin chain. But the complete failure mode would literally require the discrete logarithm problem to be broken. Now, as far as this WBTC on Ethereum, all it requires is a smart contract failure. If the contract is compromised, if funds are snatched, if that fundamentally falls apart and the ownership is shuffled around enough, then there really is no objective way to see who should have ownership of something. Like if the contract were compromised, like how do you know a holder of the tokens didn't do that? How do you know? Like it's a lot more difficult to actually go back through the historical ledger and go definitively like this is it. What if only some of the coins are compromised? Like it's a lot more screwy in terms of what do you do in a failure mode as far as distributing the actual Bitcoin back around. And it's also just fundamentally much more likely, regardless of those issues, to experience a complete failure mode, given that instead of a code base that is literally baked out of the Bitcoin code base, which is the most battle hardened one in this entire ecosystem, it's built on Ethereum. It is built on an ERC20 smart contract, which has been shown time and time and time and time again to suffer all kinds of fundamental bugs, exploitation of the control exerted in almost every contract out there with keys that can reset things, update the contract, close the contract out. And it's just much more likely that total failure is going to occur on this kind of system versus something that is much more sustainably, architected in terms of security. And the overall reason air quotes, for this platform existing in the first place is so that my Bitcoin can have smart contracts. In other words, the horrible, buggy, broken smart contracts on Ethereum, and not the much more solid, scalable, and secure ones that exist on Bitcoin and that are being developed for Bitcoin. So just the overall rationale, in my mind, is a complete joke, because it's effectively so there's more functionality for Bitcoin. Well, we're building that greater functionality on Bitcoin itself in a much more sustainable and secure way. So this just seems like a sales pitch trying to hit people who are being very impatient at the huge risk of security compromises. And it just seems, subtarted.
I do want to point out the episode where we talked about this previously was number 135, Anywhere MasterCard is Accepted.
Thank you.
How do you remember all the episode numbers?
Because she's a genius.
That is very impressive.
I don't remember them. I just looked them up.
You ruined it now. I thought you were a genius.
Clapping. So happy. Vitalik is impressed.
It's funny, the greed and short-sightedness, or like the time preference sensibilities of some of these people that get in and then they're like, I want it now. I want everything now. Like, throw all the longevity prospects in the garbage. I want to be like an Activision or EA investor. You've got all these titles, all these platforms, like a Bethesda investor. Instead of continuing to develop in the way that we have, let's cash in now. Let's use the name. Let's, subvert all of the long-term value propositions and cash in everything right now. And people that get into Bitcoin and they want that. It's like, you're going to have a bad time, because like the core version of, not the core version, I guess like the real version of Bitcoin basically is going to be the one that is the most risk managed. So the people that want to take shortcuts away from that to try to get a more feature-rich system, so to speak, by throwing the security in the garbage. I don't know, that lesson is going to have to be learned a lot by a lot of people, because unless you're a computer scientist or software project manager, it seems to you like it wouldn't be that damaging to go ahead and make some extra money now. Maybe you'll fix it later.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea of BitGo having that much control over any coin or contract or token or whatever, it doesn't interest me at all, because all of the examples I've seen of them running that kind of any infrastructure in general, I haven't been impressed. For example, BitGo was the company that did the Bitcoin wallet integration with the Brave browser when they initially still used Bitcoin, and then they got disappointed with it because of Coinbase. That's a whole other story we've talked about before. But the system that BitGo set up, first of all, it was a multi-sig, and this was for a micropayments wallet, which I don't know how insane that sounds to people who have any idea of the issues that might surface with that. But yeah, it was a multi-sig wallet where it was a 2-3 key system where they actually destroyed the third key. They just made it useless. And then one of the keys was held by BitGo and the other key was hidden somewhere in your browser, although you could never back it up. So I guess if you lost your browser, then you would also lose the Bitcoin in the wallet. It was really stupid. So I'm not too enthusiastic about anything that BitGo runs.
Ouchie. Well-deserved ouchie.
Wrecked! All right. Now that all these fake bot viewers are gone,
Oh, the bot viewers were my favorite.
are we ready to move along? All right. So, during the government shutdown, the longest in history that brought American society and civilization crashing down around our heads, VanEck and SolidX withdrew their ETF proposal because of the closing in date that would have required either approval or disapproval by the SEC to avoid the proposal being shot down. And upon the temporary reopening of the government, they have resubmitted their proposal. As well, Bitwise Investments has also submitted a proposal that would use a trusted custodian to manage the Bitcoins. And honestly, I think this is a decent strategy, although I really don't think this is going to speed anything up in the reality of the situation right now, given that another shutdown is pretty much pending unless there is actually some kind of agreement reached on a border wall funding. And so the reason I think this is a good strategy is despite that potential second shutdown, again, bringing things grinding to a halt, by withdrawing the previous proposal and resubmitting it, they have effectively reset the clock. So I'm assuming most of you know, having followed these kinds of things in the last year or two, but from the time that the proposal is actually put on the SEC docket, there is a period of 240 days where a decision must be reached. But that clock does not start counting until it's actually put on the docket. And as of right now, neither of these proposals have been. And the reason I don't think they will be anytime soon, given the second shutdown that is likely going to happen, is the SEC and the CFTC were pretty much shut down for a month and not doing anything except dealing with pending proposals like this and taking actions that they deem vital to protect property. And other than that, all of their regulatory functions had pretty much been shut down. And so they have almost a month's worth of backlog proposals and actions to look at and deal with. And frankly, things like backed or Bitcoin ETFs are not going to be high on their priority, given that they're going to have to try to catch up for this month and likely have another shutdown coming in the near future that is going to continue building this backlog. And so even the SEC hasn't really announced any kind of priorities as far as what they're going to concentrate on first. And they're kind of leaving that to their individual subdivisions to make further announcement on as the time progresses. But, despite, all of this situation, I still think it was the right thing to withdraw the proposal and refile it, because again, this has effectively reset the clock, and the clock will not start ticking until it's actually put on the docket. So if they do what I likely think they're going to do and concentrate on non-cryptocurrency related issues, it's very possible that these proposals will not even hit the SEC docket by the end of the month when another shutdown is potential. And that would pretty much leave that clock frozen at zero until this issue is dealt with finality and things actually get back to business as normal. So this has kind of allowed them to sidestep these issues of the shutdown and remove that time pressure that was building up because of this. And it's really ironic, I think, in my opinion, looking at this, because I am just as anxious as a lot of people in this space to see rulings on these ETFs and to see back to get approval from the CFTC to actually self-custody the Bitcoin in their warehouse product. But the government shutting down that that thing that I have usually laughed at and seen as so what is the thing that is holding up these market developments in the cryptocurrency space. So I do not think that the world is short on irony when it comes to things like this.
The government is always like oxygen on the fuel of markets.
On this one, in this specific case, it is.
Especially. Look at that oxygen the government's dumping on the market. Oh, look, the fire's going out. That's weird that liquid oxygen would have that effect. Who could have predicted that? Janine, do you want to make fun of the government?
Which government?
Very, very good question. It's like saying I got a haircut. Which hair?
The government. What other legitimate government exists on Earth except the United States of America?
We're like the news talking about the government.
Yes. I mean, yeah, government. I mean, there's been government shutdowns, or what they call government shutdowns, in Germany as well, and also nothing happens. Like, it's a hung parliament or whatever, nothing happens.
Well, it's funny too, because people are like, "Oh my God, these federal government employees, they're not getting paid," and it's like, no, they're being furloughed. Like, they'll be paid later unless the government never reopens again. But people are like, this is the worst thing ever. Those poor federal employees. I'm not trying to be heartless or mean or anything, but it's like, we're gonna cry over government workers with their pensions and everything. Like, really? Like, we're gonna feel bad for these people? Or like, when people are like, the journalists that are being told to learn how to code, everyone feels really bad for them. It's like, I'm not trying to be like a vicious asshole or anything, but in the context of all the people with all their problems in the whole world, like, really, we're gonna feel really bad for these people? I don't know. Maybe I'm just
like I said last time this topic came up. I think it's more of a nuanced issue of like, what is a specific federal employee's job? Because for instance, a really good friend of mine works in the forest department. Does forestry management, and he's been out of work during the entire shutdown. And I mean, that job does not involve taking property from somebody or coercing people, and him being out of work is actually piling up a lot of negative externalities for the country as a whole, because our lands are not being taken care of. And I've seen multiple incidents in a lot of national parks where there has been unbelievable amount of damage done because of people just going into these areas and not giving a shit about just throwing trash all over the place or destroying and damaging the land and the ecosystems. And like, that is going to have consequences that we're going to have to deal with for a long time, because this employee who does absolutely nothing that is coercive or violent towards people in this country was not paid to work.
Well, you see, like, I'm a realist. So when the government shuts down, I'm gonna go use my car to pull down stoplights. I'm gonna attack the mailman. It doesn't matter what your role is in the government. No, I get what you're saying. I mean, like, you gotta understand there's differences between different people and stuff. So for sure, I mean, I can see it from both ways. People like, cry into your bag of silver with your pension, or people that are like, he had nothing to do with the some of the more negative aspects of governance. Like, you shouldn't be hard on him. So I don't know. Sometimes I get in a trolley mood and people are like, I'm out of a job, and it's like, oh no, you gotta go and and troll
Should learn
somebody
to
out of a job to tell them to learn how to code. And then you laugh at the moment, and then later on you feel like, maybe I could have handled that better. But it was funny at the time.
Well, the interesting thing about that particular, I saw, because one of the guests that we're hoping to have next weekend is the creator of Libra Patron, and I saw him say that this learn to code phrase that's being used against or said towards journalists, there's some irony in it, because he said that when a lot of workers in the U.S., I think working class people were losing their jobs because of, I think it was the more lax visa restrictions on immigration or something, and they were losing jobs. Then I guess a lot of journalists were telling them to learn to code, because they had just lost their factory job. And so I don't know. I didn't look into that. I just thought it was an interesting theory that they're kind of repeating that phrase back to them, something that they had said years ago to other people losing their jobs. So
that wouldn't shock me, but in the case of like workers like that losing jobs, I think learn to code is more genuine advice. Whereas with these members of the air quote media, it's more of a you are a useless parasite. I don't give a shit.
Well, okay, the learn to code thing, I think that like we could add even more context to it. Like the way that globalization was handled under the Clinton administration ended up making it so that about 10,000 manufacturing jobs left our country every month for like a decade. And then like towards the end of this, when people were really, really, hurting for this stuff, they're like, learn how to code. And there are so many people that would have to learn how to code, and our service economy would have to become like a hyper service economy, that it wasn't really tenable advice. And it really got under a lot of people's skin. So I thought it was so funny that instantly it's like people don't forget, like as soon as they got, fired or whatever, people are like, look at the diversity picture panel for the HuffPo, whatever. And people are like, this isn't diverse. This is all women. Like this is all this isn't diverse at all. So you see the top image of it all populated and the bottom of it not populated, and then you see like everyone's out of a job. Why don't they learn how to code? And then like, why don't you learn how to code? It's just kind of referencing all of the social justice warrior happy type of journalism that they were infecting all of our media with. And I think it's funny. Like I have a really, really hard time feeling sad about it, and I have a really easy time laughing about it, which I don't know, maybe I'm just a vicious asshole, but it seems like very, very tasty karma.
Well, so am I. But did you guys see Michael Goldstein when a reporter was whining about that and said that it was something he blocked people over, and somebody else responded, yeah, I do too. And Goldstein's response was, you can automate blocking on Twitter with the Twitter API if you learn to code.
Yeah, the other funny part, I think the tweet that he actually got temporarily suspended for was the simple, I think he just asked the journalist, how is your JavaScript? And he got temporarily suspended, and then as like his apology or something to get himself unsuspended, he was like, I'm really sorry for suggesting JavaScript. I know it's a shitty language and I should have said Python instead. But yeah, I mean, so far from what I've seen, the biggest layoffs have been at BuzzFeed and Vice. And I have to be perfectly frank, the number of times that I see articles from Vice and BuzzFeed that are just plain garbage and clickbait nonsense, I very rarely read them, especially like it's a waste of time to read anything about Bitcoin, especially in Vice Motherboard. So, I mean, it also doesn't surprise me. Like the reason they're getting, I assume the reason they're getting laid off is because most of what they write is not, it's like at some point journalism has to actually be useful. I think Chris has said this before, and I don't remember where he got it from, but he says like at the end of the day, people need to know the truth. And so you can delay that as much as possible and just churn out garbage, but eventually people are just going to stop reading what you write because it's not useful to them. And there are some writers who are not terrible at both of those, but in general, they're just, I don't use them as part of my research, and so I'm not surprised that they're having massive layoffs, because I don't think a lot of those writers have actually, they haven't looked at whether what they're writing is useful.
Yeah, it was almost like a race to the bottom. There was the democratization of publishing, and then there was like the clickbait wars, where it was like, I'm gonna have the most clickbaity thing ever. It doesn't matter what the journalistic content of my article is. It matters how clickbaity is the thing on top, and how much ire can I rile up in people and get them to argue, because then my article will be the focal point of a lot of eyes that will get, you know, ad views, instead of trying to be like, what are the tenets of journalistic integrity? To the extent that Vice and BuzzFeed, you could have their articles and be like, here's journalistic integrity, here's what not to do, and you can publish a whole bunch of their stuff. So they actually have a very, very healthy and extensive catalog of, you know, how not to be a journalist. You can go back into their records and see how you don't want to go about things.
Mm-hmm. You know, and just, I don't know, my last comment on this. The one thing that really kills me about Vice in particular over the last 10 years is like they used to actually be real journalism. Like they actually would investigate things and research and not just publish like this pop opinion crap. And like over the last 10 years, they've just like completely swung to the other side of the spectrum where it's like I can't even remember the last thing I've seen out of Vice that was actually like real investigative journalism.
Well, and I don't know, a lot of journalists, like they don't feel the way that like journalists, the way that they used to feel, would like, you'd be talking to a journalist and they would get all serious and they would look you right in the face and they would be like, at all times and all costs, the truth. Like that's a fucking good journalist. And if you talk to modern journalists and stuff, they'll be like, you know, I want to be trendy. And it's like, that's not going to be enough of a why motivator to get you to, you know, hunker down through the hard times and not reveal sources and all that stuff. So, you know, I don't know, hopefully there'll be a positive purge of people that don't have what it takes to be real good journalists.
Janine quoted me as saying that we need the truth. I got that from life. That's where I got that from. If you, yeah,
like cereal or the game?
No, the game called Life. Whoever fucking designed this virtual reality for us all that we're currently sitting in, they didn't do a very good job. I much prefer the games that are being made for mobile right now. I'm fully addicted. But in all seriousness, like the games that you play on the internet or on your phone or on a console, you know, the goals are pretty clear. That's why I like it, because I know what I got to do. Whereas life is just an infinite game. And I think a lot of the problem can be summed up with journalism is just short term versus long term. If you've got demands on your living standards, you know, if you've got to pay your rent and your landlord is coming to you and saying, yeah, but if you don't pay this, you haven't got shelter over your head. And then the journalist turns around to his readership and says, if you don't pay me, I guess you'll have to read an article somewhere else by someone else. Okay, so that's a little bit of a mismatch, right? You got some rent extraction going on there from the landlord. But the point is, you've got to demand it. It's no point blaming the journalists. As readers, you've got to demand it. You know, if there isn't a demand, then no one's going to satisfy. If there is a demand for immediate gratification, then that's what you're going to get. I mean, shame on both sides, frankly. You know, the one side for demanding the wrong thing, the other side for catering to that demand unquestioningly. There are some journalists around still. And we watched the guy at W3C, oh, I never pronounced that right, Chaos Computer Conference, CCC, this year, the one just gone. And so there are, you know, real journalists still out there, but they have to hustle. You know, they really have to hustle. Maybe their parents are paying the rent, or, you know, they've got some kind of independent wealth action going on. Maybe they're running a drug you know, maybe they're kingpins on the side and they've got a scam going on, but then they give you, you know, the good quality journalism. But
hey,
yeah,
how do you give us such good information on drug smuggling?
I mean, to what extent does, you know, the good rely on the bad? And if we can just cover up the bad, then we go, well, everything's just fine, until, you know, you invent something like the internet, and then the cost of keeping information private just goes up exponentially. It's, oh shit, now we see all the crap that was going on just to create the perception of the good, and we're actually all living in hell after all. Sorry, that's not a very positive thought.
Jesus, buddy, I'm gonna
wow, I don't know what got into me.
Dystopia is unavoidable.
The cost of freedom is eternal vigilance.
All right, I just had to exercise monumental self-control to not start screaming things from Harry Potter. All right. All right. We got 2 more stories left in about 20 minutes. So, anything else to say on the topic of journalism and coding? All right. I'll take that as a no. All right. So, next up is another follow up from a past story. So, we recently, again, episode unknown, covered a German stock exchange, Boerse Stuttgart, the second largest stock exchange in the country, that was planning on offering the ability to trade Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and Ripple without trading fees. And their trading app has officially launched. So it is a mobile app called Bison that's available on both iOS and Android and was special built by them over the course of a year. And it's pretty much just a seamless app connecting to their trading platform, actually operated by the stock exchange with 0 trading fees. And obviously, there is KYC required, which is done over a video identification process. And as of right now, trading on Bison is only available from 6 a.m. in the morning until midnight, 7 days a week. Although they do say that they are planning on shifting to 24-hour trading to fit in with the actual cryptocurrency markets at some time in the future. And as far as withdrawals from the platform, the actual process, does not seem to fit with normal exchanges, although it is possible. It says that you actually have to raise a request. So I'm assuming not like a seamless just withdraw button like other platforms in order to transfer your cryptocurrencies to another wallet. Although they do explicitly say that you can withdraw. It's not very clear how that actual process will flow or is structured. But the way it does seem in this article from Bitcoinist is it seems to kind of differentiate itself from the direct, automated integration that a lot of other platforms have. And one of the one feature that actually seems really unique in this, and I find, a bit odd, but also kind of interesting as something that a product built by an actual stock exchange like this would actually do. But there's actually a feature called Crypto Radar built into the app that tracks all of the crypto Twitter activity and actually using deep learning presents what it seems is like the best or most relevant news to the user. And I thought this was, kind of interesting just because of the general shift from the typical flow of information in this space, amongst all the different communities in the ecosystem is generally very fragmented and tribal to a large degree, using platforms like Twitter and other social media. And it's not something that's very easy to really follow the flow of, aside from the news platforms that try to condense and make highlights. And I thought it was just kind of very interesting how they chose to build a feature like this into the platform that's attempting to kind of go through the actual direct flow of information in the different communities and ecosystem itself and present that to the users as a kind of information source to inform themselves on how they choose to trade or manage their assets. And I think it kind of sets them apart from all the other platforms out there. And it's not kind of just leaving you to yourself, and it's not just doing something like throwing you links to Coinbase. Like, it is actually going to where market participants communicate and trying to actually digest that directly to present to people as information about what's going on in the space.
All right, so I have some things that I noticed when I was looking at their website. First of all, under, let's see, I think it's under one of the first questions in their FAQ. I don't know if you saw it, but their motto is apparently, "We are neither bull nor bear, simply bison." And then you already listed off the cryptocurrencies they offer, which includes Ripple, which is hilarious. And then there's a question, what options do I have for using Bison? They say that after successful verification, you can buy and sell cryptocurrencies at Bison with real money, euros. Additionally, they say that the requirements to use the app is that you must be at least 18 years old. You must have iOS updated versions of iOS and Android. You must have a German bank account. Doesn't matter which bank, but you must have a bank account, which guess, no unbanked people. You must have residence in Germany. You must be a citizen of a country in the European Economic Area. You can only use Bison for private purposes, and you cannot be taxable in the US, which that leaves a lot of people out, doesn't it? And the KYC, like Shinobi said, includes video verification and stuff. What was the other thing I noticed? I think that was it. I just thought their motto was really funny about being a Bison.
We're not bulls or bears, just bison. I love that one quote. What was it? By Matthew McConaughey. Nobody knows if something's going to go up or down or round in circles in the short term, least of all Bitcoiners.
But yeah, it's just, this is something that's actually, showing that institutional interest and involvement is not just something concentrated to Wall Street in America. And, like I said, with this crypto radar feature, it shows that like the players in institutional money, they're not just kind of blindly following facts. Like their attitude is not like, crypto exchanges looking for the hottest shit coin that's buzzing on Twitter to list. Like these people are actually really looking at the fundamentals and analyzing what these systems enable in terms of new functionality that they can bring to people through products or how they structure their own systems and businesses, and really giving deep thought about how to interact with them. Like these are people with, very long time horizons and low time preference that are actually serious about this, and not just kind of following the Silicon Valley startup model that's infested a lot of this space, where it's just buzz, new thing, like dive into it without actually giving it deep thought and analysis. Like they're functioning with the exact polar opposite attitude of that. All right.
Before you move on, I want to point out that I think Chris had an aneurysm when you said really unique, because that is not a proper phrase.
Well, I don't care because his English is wrong. We speak American here.
I said something in an interview. I was really excited about Bitcoin reaching increased ubiquity, and a whole bunch of people jumped on me. They're like, you can't say increased ubiquity. It's either ubiquitous or not. And I was like, oh, shut up. I was trying to sound fancy.
Yeah, exactly.
All
I mean, the most common one is you speak good English. Speak English well. And I got that was specifically from a movie where a British guy said good English to a German guy, and the German guy corrected him. So.
Oh, that's embarrassing.
It's funny though. All right, the last up is not really relevant unless you live in Florida, but back in 2016, Michael Espinoza was charged with illegally transmitting and laundering $1,500 of Bitcoin when he was hit in a sting operation where the law enforcement agent who purchased Bitcoin through him specifically told him that he was planning on using it to purchase illegally procured data. And in 2016, this was thrown out in Miami-Dade Circuit Court under the basis that Bitcoin did not constitute money and so could not facilitate money laundering. And now, 3 years later, a appeals court has thrown out this dismissal and declared that for the purposes of this case, Bitcoin is something that can function as money. and they're going back to court essentially with no set date right now. But this kind of shows that the one of the big issues in the United States is just the fragmentation of the regulatory landscape, given that each state has an entirely different set of regulations and methods for handling these kinds of things. And there's no real federal clarity as far as, where cryptocurrency fits into this patchwork of regulation. And, this just goes to show, like 3 years ago, this person was acquitted of these charges, and that court set a precedent that for these kinds of cases, like Bitcoin was not money. He was not required to register himself as a money transmitter in a business. And 3 years later, an appeals court has overturned that precedent, and this is now going to be going back to court as an undecided matter, where it seems likely, to me at least, looking at this, that it's pretty likely Florida is going to decide that cryptocurrency does fall into the category of money and leaves people subject to things like money laundering charges or requirements to register as a money service business if they are trading in cryptocurrencies beyond just divesting themselves of personal investments or making personal investments. And a large number of people on platforms like Local Bitcoins do this as a business. They play the arbitrage between exchanges and set premiums. So this would very much be something that would affect any kind of peer-to-peer trader of cryptocurrencies in Florida. And like that precedent, that way that these things are handled differs from state to state. So like this is an issue that really does need some kind of federal clarity as far as, where Bitcoin and other things fall into these kinds of categories and how they should be handled regulatorily. Because, this is something a lot of people actually do to make a living off of since this space has grown. And it's even in the case of, like, if he had walked away when told these Bitcoin were going to be used for something illegal, there's absolutely nothing down the line that would have prevented the same exact kind of sting operation without that statement to entrap somebody and simply catching him for not being registered as a money transmitter. And like, it's not necessarily that these people are intentionally trying to violate the law in every case. It's that there is no real clarity on how they should be handling or declaring their source of legitimate income that they make a living off of. And that's something that absolutely needs that clarity.
Yeah, I mean, the legal structure was already unknowable before Bitcoin was invented, and now we're inventing things at the speed of light. Bitcoin is changing it almost, arguably the speed of light, and the legacy regulatory framework was already kind of like, and now with the, like, it's such a big deal that I was actually involved in Bitcoin for a long time before I was publicly involved in Bitcoin, because I waited for the IRS to make a statement about what Bitcoin was so that I wouldn't just be summarily executed by my local police for using my name and talking about it. So again, the law being unknowable, and then on top of that, inventing new technologies is like, I don't know, man. The government's fantastic, and we all love it a lot, right?
Wait, so it's the government's fault again? Did I hear that right?
It's the government's fault for everything.
I'm on Block Digest, right?
Is it Dunning-Kruger?
The government's fault.
The
Dunning-Kruger.
Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah. Wait, so I've got a question. How fast does time go then? You said everything moves at the speed of C. It's the universal constant. How fast does time travel?
Time travels as fast as it has to as a consequence of the things that are occurring within the space being measured. So if all motion goes to zero, time goes to zero. But time has to be, quote, fast enough to be able to.
No, it can't be. It can't be conditioned on motion.
1 second per second.
Well, it's not just motion though; it's also complexity. And
anyway, rabbit hole. But we need to get a physicist on to settle that. But we're inventing things at the speed of light. That made me think, yes. So the thing is that lawyers can't keep up with the rate of change in technology. The rate of change is increasing. And we've got all these requirements in our constitutions in various different countries across the world that require a certain, process to be followed, almost sort of due process, as it were, if you will, that has to be gone through. But that takes time. There is a 0 day in the judicial system, which is that it can't stop time. The court can't travel to you to kind of settle your grievances in instantly. Unfortunately, you do have to spend money, travel through time and space in order to seek out your justice. That's all I have.
I think Janine has something.
She's got a final thought. So if there are no more inputs on this story, I guess that takes us to final random thoughts.
Florida man stories are always good. This is probably the only one where the Florida man does not sound insane.
All right, Janine, divulge your thought.
I mean, if you want to play like the first, 20 seconds of it, it's just him saying he was on the Joe Rogan podcast and everyone is going crazy about this yesterday because he said that Bitcoin would be the native currency of the internet, and that he was specifically asked about the Cash App, and Joe Rogan asked if he was going to accept any other cryptocurrencies or integrate any other ones, and he said probably not at the moment.
All right, switching audio input.
Do you have "Don't Be Evil" in the Cash App's code of conduct? Maybe we should take it. It's open. It's free now.
One of our equivalent operating principles within Cash and Square is how do we understand someone's struggle? How do we understand, how do we have the empathy for what they're struggling with? And when it comes to finance, they're struggling with a lot.
Yeah. Typically
they're struggling with a ton.
What was the thought process with, one of the things that's kind of cool about the Cash App is that you can buy and sell Bitcoin with it.
Yeah.
Are you guys going to consider other forms of cryptocurrency as well?
Not right now. So back to the internet, I believe the internet will have a native currency.
Really?
It'll have a native currency. And I don't know if it's Bitcoin. I think it will, because just given all the tests it's been through and the principles behind it, how it was created, and it was something that was born on the internet, that was developed on the internet, that was tested on the internet. It is of the internet. And the reason we enabled the purchasing of Bitcoin within the Cash App is, one, we want to learn about the technology and we want to put ourselves out there and take some risk. We're the first publicly traded company to actually offer it as a service. We're the first publicly traded company to talk to the SEC about Bitcoin and what that means. And it made us uncomfortable. We had to really understand what was going on, and that was critical and important. And then the second thing is that we would love to see something become a global currency. It enables more access. It allows us to serve more people. It allows us to move much faster around the world. And we thought we were going to start with how you can use it transactionally, but we noticed that people were treating it more like an asset, like a virtual gold, and we wanted just to make that easy, just the simplest way to buy and sell Bitcoin. But we also knew that it had to come with a lot of education. It had to come with constraint, because 2 years ago, people did some really
2 years ago, people did some really unspeakable things with Bitcoin.
What happened 2 years ago? I want to know.
Well, you'll have to go watch the whole episode to find out.
I'm going to do that tonight. That looks really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
can we copy strike Block Digest?
Go fuck yourself. But
no. So the funny, I have to tell you, the funniest copyright strike we ever got was when Shinobi played a video of Santa's having a street brawl, I think in France or something, and there was it's beginning to look a lot like. Or is it?
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
And we got it was maybe 15 seconds or something, not very long, and it was just background music, and it got a copyright strike.
Oh, YouTube.
But yeah, I don't know. I watched some of the talk with Jack. I didn't get to the part on cryptocurrencies yet, but I thought it was kind of, interesting. And I mean, I've seen a unbelievable amount of backlash about that episode because Joe didn't dig into him about censorship and politics. And it's honestly like, well, he's the CEO. Like he's not sitting there running every aspect of the system. Like you can't expect him to break down how this support person handled this and why for each individual thing that's ever happened on the platform. And honestly, I think that would just be a pointless interview. I mean, I think it was much more interesting to actually hear his rationale and attitudes towards how the platform evolved and like what he wanted out of it, rather than just Joe like, what the fuck about this? And Jack like, I don't know. So like,
well, I think an interesting question that Joe could have asked was when he said we like Bitcoin because we like the principles of it. It was born out of cypherpunk and out of the internet. It would have been interesting, I think, if Joe would have said, do you think that it's hard to bring those principles to Twitter when you're not the sole person in charge of Twitter, when you have to talk to and agree with all these other people? And I think that would have been an interesting question to ask. But I think you're right. If you asked it in an attacking way, don't attackize, as PewDiePie has coined, but try to actually converse and say, why is it that all these rules are come to on Twitter that seem anti-free speech? How much control do you have over that?
Yeah, and from what I've seen of Joe Rogan, he doesn't seem like the kind of person who attacks his guests like that. He doesn't like, he'll challenge them, but I've never seen him get aggressive or ask questions that make his guests uncomfortable. I don't know. I have an ambivalent view of Jack because on one hand I see all of, like, he'll say, I'm like trying out fasting. Like, what do you guys think? And they'll be like, oh, you're experimenting with starvation. You're such a privileged, blah, blah, blah. And there is some truth to that. Like, he's the person he'll like, I never want to be the type of person that just, or I don't think I ever will be the type of person who just tweets out like things that I'm doing. I mostly don't do that, things that I'm doing on a daily basis or any of that, because I don't like, but that must be hard for him because he has such a huge audience that he can't say anything without someone coming along and bashing him for it. And of course, like, the biggest incident was when I think he went to Bangladesh. I can't remember he took like a vacation to a country that was having some human rights issues, and people were complaining that he wasn't bringing enough attention to that, and instead was talking about like fasting and sitting in one place for a very long time and how you could make pain go away with your thoughts or something by, I don't know, whatever. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Joe didn't take that kind of stance, because I feel like he gets enough of that already that Joe Rogan doesn't need to contribute to that.
I just feel like I've seen Joe Rogan be really hard on certain guests. Like when Candace Owens was on his show, he asked her a lot about climate change. And she was like, it's not a hill that I would die on, but I feel like climate change is oversold in terms of its risks, because I think there's maybe other motivations in terms of globalization, centralization of control and taxes and stuff. And he wouldn't let it go. He kept hammering against her and being like, you're not a scientist. Why would you say that? I wish he had gone a lot easier on her and was a lot harder on Jack. Because I mean, I guess I watch maybe Joe Rogan more than your average person. And I kind of have seen differences in terms of how he treats different guests. I really liked the Elon Musk interview. I think that was a good balance. I think that the Jack interview wasn't as balanced, but I mean, that's just kind of my subjective opinion on it. From I haven't even watched the whole thing, but from what I did catch, it just seemed like it maybe would have been better had Joe pushed a little bit, not to the point of being rude, but even kind of pushed it all almost.
All right, so Blake, Chris, guys got any final thoughts before I unveil my meme that I found like an hour late?
Well, as you could tell on this show today, we cleverly wove a theme and a motif that was underpinning it, well, didn't we, about the impact that social media has. And I love the way that we ended on Jack Dorsey after we'd already raised issues of the sort of the ephemerality and the spontaneity and the emotional reactions that social media can really elicit. I wonder what this kind of low latency, high transaction throughput communications channel like Twitter really does to us mentally, like psychologically, every single day, the impact that it has, the different internal chemical makeups of our bodies and what it does to our health when we're constantly bombarded with all this information, in a way that we weren't in the past. And I really liked what Jack said at the end about how Bitcoin has, high educational requirements. This isn't just something you can say, here, now we support Bitcoin. That comes with, I love what was really implied in what he was saying was that we now have a responsibility to teach you about it as well. We can't just say, here you go. It's got lots of sharp edges. I say at work all the time that, you're making a tool that is very dangerous and hazardous. I mean, you're making, hammers and nails and drills. You wouldn't just throw these things into the market and say, here, have at it. You would put some manual with it. You would give an advisory. You wouldn't just do it, in the packaging. You would also have marketing channels that would also distribute that information to tell people how to use it safely. Because I think that what it really boils down to with this immutable database that we're creating is that people have to take ownership of the risk ultimately. And right now they don't, because they feel, I think a lot of ordinary non-technical, let's say, non-technical people feel like the culture from which Bitcoin comes is esoteric, and I think they find it countercultural, but they do accept that this technorati class, if I can call it that, they have had a lot of influence in the last sort of 15, 20 years. I mean, these technocrats have been, well, that's not actually the right word, but this technorati group of people have been giving us new habits every year, to the point where we now look back and we see all of these new things that we're doing. We're behaving, in a completely different way than we were 10 years ago, because every year new products come out. They tempt you and nudge you. That's even a technical term. They nudge you into behaviors that you haven't performed before using incentive models and so on. And so I think there is a sort of fait accompli around Bitcoin where, yes, like Jack says, it is the most tested. It's by far the biggest network. And, what they often say in business when you go into an investor pitch is they ask, what is your unfair advantage? Tell me that you've got someone on your board of directors who's, also, a big player in the retail sector, so that you've got a way in that your competitors won't have. And Bitcoin does have that. It has the first mover advantage, and it has used that well, and has used it to the extent that it now is by far the largest networked computer system the planet has ever seen. I mean, it's orders of magnitude bigger than its nearest competitor. So the idea that that would come crumbling down just magically, I think is a bit naive, and you're not really understanding the magnitude of what you're dealing with. And I think betting against technology has never really served anyone well historically. And I think it's just too easy, intellectually very lazy, to fall back on, well, it's the underlying technology. It's not Bitcoin, it's the underlying technology that really matters. It's a very intellectually lazy argument, in my opinion, and it just shows a lack of sophistication. And what I'm hearing in Jack is, I think Jack gets it. I really think he gets it. And I think, like he said, so often when you're building products, it's about what you learn as a product owner as well. And I think that's what I was hearing Jack as well. We wanted to put Bitcoin into our app because we wanted to learn about it. And that's really good. That's the sign of a good product owner, someone who really does have a grasp of the what the needs are from his fellow human beings. And he wants to try and build something, but he understands that that's a two-way process, and that he's going to have something to learn as well. So that's my final thought.
I agree with a lot of the things that you said. I think that it's correct to identify Bitcoin as having certain duties that are not, that you can't assign to somebody else. You cannot delegate certain duties. Society cannot delegate certain honeypots of responsibility, and that responsibility coming home to roost is a huge part of Bitcoin. It's a huge part of the information that people need to digest and accept for the future to be able to take hold, is that we need to disenfranchise some of these giant honeypots of power that are able to corrupt the most valuable thing, which is control over human action. If we can decentralize the incentive systems that enable human action to move forward, that's what good versions of the future will be made of. And to hear Jack reference that in any way, shape, or form, I think is a positive thing. So I think it's basically, I'm just very wholeheartedly agreeing with Chris's conclusion, because I think that that's a big part of the nature of change that is coming, a different type of understanding what the individual role is in terms of absorbing what percentage of responsibility that has not worked out in legacy situations.
Alrighty then. And I guess my final thought is simply a meme that I was trying to interrupt Janine with when it was contextually appropriate, but could not find it. I give you Francis Coppola, everybody. And on that note, toodaloo, everyone.
See ya.
Bye-bye.